The first thing Damon noticed about Holloway Fun Park was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that presses against your skin, making you feel like you're standing in the center of something that isn't quite dead yet. The air smelled like rotting wood and old rain, the scent of something long abandoned but not entirely forgotten. The towering archway at the entrance, once bright with flashing lights, was now a rusted skeleton of what it used to be. The words Holloway Fun Park were barely legible, half the letters missing, the other half faded to a ghostly outline. A long, rusted chain wrapped around the gate, locking it shut. But that wasn't what made Damon hesitate. It was the sound. Faint, almost too distant to be real, a slow, wheezing melody drifted through the air. Carnival music. Soft, broken notes carried on the wind, warping slightly as if the Calliope was running on its last dying breath. He stopped breathing for a second, straining his ears. It was probably just in his head. Had to be. The place had been shut down for 30 years. There was no reason for any music to still be playing. He shook it off, exhaling as he yanked the heavy padlock off the chain. The moment it hit the ground, a long, rusted creak rang through the air as the gates slowly drifted open on their own. He hadn't even touched them. Damon froze, heart pounding, but there was no wind. No reason they should have moved. Just old hinges settling, he told himself. Just old metal shifting under its own weight. He stepped inside. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, everything felt wrong. The silence was worse in here. He could hear every crunch of gravel beneath his boots, every breath leaving his lungs. The place felt too still, too aware, as if it had been waiting. Damon hadn't wanted this job. He wasn't the kind of guy who's scared easy, but desperation makes people do things they wouldn't normally do. He needed the money, and the pay was suspiciously high. $5,000 a week just to watch an empty park? That alone should have been a red flag. But bills don't wait, and he was out of options. His boss, Mr. Holloway, had never met him in person. Just a short phone call, a wired deposit, and an envelope waiting at the security office with his name on it. Holloway had sounded off, his voice dry and strained, acted like someone who hadn't slept in a long time. The rules are in the office. Follow them. You'll be fine, was all he had said before hanging up. No explanation, no small talk, just those words. Now, standing here, Damon was starting to regret ever picking up the phone. The main walkway stretched ahead, lined with broken-down attractions. Rusted rides groaned softly in the wind, motionless but not quite lifeless. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, its skeletal frame black against the night sky, the carts dangling like severed limbs. The carousel stood frozen in time, its once vibrant horses peeling, their glass eyes dull and cracked. Somewhere near the game stalls, a single balloon lay half deflated on the ground, its faded red surface barely visible in the dim light. He swore it wasn't there a second ago. Damon pulled his jacket tighter around himself and kept walking. The security office was near the old food court, tucked between a row of abandoned ticket booths. When he found it, the door was already unlocked. Inside, the room was small and smelled like dust and mildew. A battered old desk sat in the corner, its surface covered in cobwebs and scattered papers. A single black and white monitor flickered on the wall, showing grainy security feeds of the park. Most of the screens were static, but a few still worked, displaying flickering images of empty walkways, lifeless rides, and something else. Something Damon couldn't quite put his finger on. A logbook lay open on the desk, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. Next to it was an envelope with his name scrawled across it in jagged handwriting. He picked it up, fingers cold, and tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a list of rules typed in bold, uneven letters. His eyes skimmed down the list, his stomach tightening with each rule. 1. The park opens for them at night. Do not interfere with any movements you see. 2. If you hear footsteps behind you, keep walking. You are not alone. 3. If you hear your own voice outside, ignore it. It is not you. 4. The funhouse doors will be locked. Do not try to enter. 5. If you see Benny the Clown move, do not acknowledge it. Do not speak first. 6. The carousel music may play on its own. This is normal. Do not be near it when it stops. 7. If you hear laughter behind you, do not turn around, no matter what. The last rule made his skin crawl. Damon set the paper down slowly, pulse hammering in his ears. His gut told him to walk out right now, to forget the money and get back in his car. But as he glanced at the darkened screens, something flickered in the corner of one of the feeds. The carousel. The horses were still. The ride wasn't moving. But the screen had glitched for a split second. And in that moment, he could have sworn he saw a small figure standing beside the horses. A little girl. Damon blinked hard, leaning in closer. But the feed was normal again. The carousel was empty. Just a trick of the screen. A glitch. Outside, a distant creak echoed through the park. Something was moving. Damon's breath caught in his throat. The laughter outside had faded, but the silence that replaced it was worse. It felt watchful. The kind of silence that doesn't just exist, it waits. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned the brittle pages of the worn folder, scanning the list of rules. Each one was more unsettling than the last. The words were written in neat, deliberate handwriting, but some of them had been underlined with such force that the paper had torn. His eyes drifted to a second, older logbook sitting beneath the folder, its leather cover cracked with age. He hesitated before flipping it open. The entries were written by past security guards, and the pages reeked of desperation. Many entries were smudged, others scratched out entirely, as if someone had tried to erase their own warnings. Then he found the final entry. The ink was darker, fresher than the rest, but the date, October 14th, 1994, sent a chill down his spine. The name signed at the bottom was Marcus Lane. Damon swallowed hard and read the entry. If you hear your name over the PA system, you have 30 seconds to hide. If the carousel music plays at 3:12 a.m., do not look at the horses. If Benny the Clown speaks first, do not answer. Never turn around when you hear laughter behind you. The last sentence wasn't a rule. It was a warning, scrawled with shaking hands. This place is hungry. Damon exhaled, rubbing his temples. This had to be a joke, some elaborate prank. Maybe the last security guards just had a messed up sense of humor. But the longer he sat in that tiny, suffocating room, the more the unease sank into his bones. Then, at 1:45 a.m., something knocked at the window. A slow, deliberate knock. Damon froze. His eyes flickered to the small, grimy window beside the security desk. The glass was fogged over from the cold, but beyond it, there was nothing but darkness. Could have been the wind, he reasoned. Maybe an animal. But then came a second knock, and a third. His skin prickled. He turned toward the window, peering into the murky blackness beyond. There was no one there, just the empty, rotting amusement park. The Ferris wheel stood motionless in the distance, and the game stalls sat like abandoned tombs. Then a voice. A whisper, so faint he almost thought he imagined it. "Let me in." Damon's blood ran cold. The voice was his. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. His mind raced, scrambling for some kind of rational explanation. But there wasn't one. Then he remembered the rules. With shaking hands, he flipped back through the folder, his eyes locking onto rule number 3. If you hear your own voice outside, ignore it. It is not you. His pulse pounded in his ears. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay still. Another knock. "Let me in, Damon." It was louder this time, closer. He gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. The air in the room felt heavier, thicker, like the walls were closing in. His own breath sounded too loud in his ears. Then silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A shadow, tall, motionless, pressed against the window. It was his shape, his height, his outline. But the eyes, they were empty. Just hollow pits of blackness. And then, ever so slowly, it grinned. Not a human grin. Not something a face should be able to do. The mouth stretched too wide, the corners curling up unnaturally, exposing too many teeth. Damon's breath hitched. His body screamed at him to move, to run, to hide, but he couldn't acknowledge it. The rule was clear. His heartbeat slammed against his ribs as the shadow tilted its head, watching him. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, it was gone. No footsteps, no movement, just vanished. Damon sat there, his whole body locked in place, until he was sure it wasn't coming back. Finally, he let out the breath he had been holding. The logbook had been right. The rules weren't a joke, and this park was far from empty. Damon's hands were still trembling as he sat in the dimly lit security office, the weight of the past few minutes pressing against his chest like a vice. He had read the rules. He had followed them. But the encounter at the window had shattered any lingering doubts. There was something here with him, something that knew his name, knew his voice, and wore his face. The air inside the security room felt suffocating. He needed to move, to distract himself from the lingering sense of something watching. He grabbed his flashlight, clipped the walkie-talkie to his belt, and stepped out into the cold, dead park. The silence outside was thick, pressing against his ears like cotton. The mist curled around the rides like ghostly fingers, swallowing the distant edges of the amusement park. His boots crunched against the pavement as he began his rounds, sweeping the flashlight across rusting roller coasters, shattered game booths, and abandoned food stalls. Then he saw it, the Laughing Funhouse. Its entrance yawned open like a hungry mouth, the peeling paint around the archway resembling jagged, broken teeth. Above the doorway, a flickering neon sign buzzed weakly, barely clinging to life. "The Laughing Funhouse, come inside and stay forever!" Damon swallowed hard, and standing directly in front of it was Benny the Clown. The mascot was massive, 7 feet tall, its frame unnaturally lanky yet broad. The old costume was faded, the once bright reds and yellows now dull and sickly. Its porcelain face was cracked, exposing the grayish stuffing beneath. The smile, that awful painted-on grin, was split down the middle, warped into something that felt wrong. Damon's stomach twisted. Benny wasn't supposed to be here. The last time he saw the mascot, it had been inside the locked storage unit. The flashlight trembled slightly in his grip. He forced himself to breathe evenly, to keep walking. He knew the rule. Do not acknowledge Benny if he speaks first. The park was testing him. Damon kept his pace steady, eyes forward, refusing to look directly at the clown. His pulse pounded in his skull. Then, a sound, a chuckle, low, breathless, too close. Damon stopped. His breath turned to ice. No, I didn't hear that. The laughter echoed softly through the funhouse entrance, the neon sign buzzing louder, as if reacting to it. Damon's grip on the flashlight tightened until his knuckles turned white. He forced himself to keep walking, his boots scraping against the pavement. One step, another. Then the lights flickered. In that half-second of darkness, Benny moved. Damon's stomach dropped. The clown was facing him now. He had not heard footsteps, had not heard fabric shifting. But Benny had turned. The glassy, dead eyes stared right at him. Don't acknowledge him. Damon's fingers curled into a fist. Keep walking, keep walking. Then, in a voice that was too human, too wet, Benny whispered, "Damon, do you want to play?" Damon's legs almost gave out. His entire body screamed at him to react, to run, to yell, to do something. But he clenched his teeth so hard he thought they might crack. His boots scraped against the pavement as he took another step, and another. The laughter didn't stop. It followed him, low, rasping. His fingers hovered near his walkie-talkie, sweat slicking the plastic as he considered radioing for help, but there was no one to call. Then, the walkie crackled. Static. Then a voice. "You forgot to say goodnight, Damon." It wasn't Benny's voice. It wasn't his own. But it knew his name. Damon's body stiffened, his throat tightening as the laughter behind him grew louder. And this time, it was right at his ear. Damon's breath hitched. The laughter at his ear, that awful rasping sound, was so close he swore he could feel the dampness of breath against his skin. His muscles locked, his body screaming for him to run, to fight, to do anything. But he did neither. Instead, he clenched his jaw, forcing himself to walk. Each step away from Benny felt like pulling himself from quicksand. The laughter didn't stop. It followed him, whispering, chuckling, but he didn't acknowledge it, didn't run, didn't turn around. By the time he reached the security office, his shirt was sticking to his back with cold sweat. His fingers trembled as he shoved the door open and stepped inside, slamming it shut behind him. Silence. No more laughter. No more whispering. His chest heaved as he pressed his back against the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to regain control of his breathing. What the hell is happening in this place? Damon dragged a shaking hand down his face before pushing himself off the door. His fingers twitched toward the walkie-talkie, but who would he even call? There was no backup, no one to report to. He was alone. His gaze flickered to the mirror mounted on the opposite wall. A small, rectangular thing, clouded with dust and grime. His own pale, shaken face stared back at him. For some reason, seeing himself like that made him feel more grounded, like proof that he was still here, still real, still himself. He let out a slow, uneven breath, moving toward the desk, trying to steady his thoughts. And then, his reflection blinked. Damon's blood turned to ice. Because he hadn't blinked. His body froze mid-step. The thing in the mirror didn't move either. It stood there, watching. A sharp, suffocating cold spread through Damon's limbs, locking him in place. His mind raced, trying to rationalize. Maybe it was just his imagination, just exhaustion messing with him. Then it grinned. Not a normal grin. Not his grin. The lips stretched too wide, too unnatural. The skin around the mouth cracked, splitting at the edges. Damon's breath hitched. The rules. The damn rules. Rule number 8. If your reflection moves on its own, do not break eye contact. His pulse pounded against his skull. Don't break eye contact. Don't break eye contact. Don't. A deep, slow creak echoed from somewhere in the room, like something shifting. The thing in the mirror wasn't just smiling now. It was watching, studying. Then it lifted a hand. Damon didn't. His real hand stayed at his sides, frozen. But the reflection? It waved. Damon's stomach lurched, his throat tightening so hard he thought he might choke on air. The room felt wrong, tilted, off balance. The kind of wrong that sent primal signals through the brain, the same feeling as standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing the drop was inevitable. His mouth was dry. The reflection took a step forward. But Damon hadn't moved. No, 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 no. The glass began to ripple, warping like water. The grin widened, teeth sharpening, gums darkening. A deep, wet sound crawled from its throat, like something trying to speak through a mouth not meant for words. The temperature in the room plummeted. Damon could see his own breath now, little white puffs leaving his lips. His knees nearly buckled. Then, the mirror cracked. A single sharp line split down the center, straight through the thing's face. Damon finally breathed, but the air felt wrong in his lungs. Because his reflection, the thing wearing his skin, was still grinning. Damon didn't move, didn't blink. The reflection stared back at him, its grin stretched impossibly wide despite the jagged crack running through its face. The edges of its lips curled unnaturally, splitting the skin, exposing something black and rotting underneath. The fractured glass rippled again, the distortion warping the room behind him. His stomach clenched as he forced himself to step back. Then, a noise, soft, rustling, like paper shifting. His head snapped toward the desk. The logbook. Damon swallowed hard, dragging himself away from the cursed mirror and toward the desk. He flipped open the logbook, his hands still trembling. The pages were worn, yellowed with age, filled with cramped, hurried handwriting. And then, a name. Ivy Calloway. Damon's pulse slowed. The name was familiar, too familiar. Frowning, he flipped through the pages until he found it again. A report. A missing child's report. Damon skimmed over the words, his breath catching as he read. Ivy Calloway, age 7, disappeared, August 12, 1994. Last seen near the carousel at 3:12 a.m. Body never recovered. A sharp chill traced his spine. His gaze dropped lower, scanning the next section, a scrawled note written in hurried, uneven letters. Rule number 9. If you see a crying child near the carousel, do not help her. It is not a child. Damon's fingers clenched around the paper. His stomach sank. And then, the music started. That damn carousel music. A slow, eerie tune, warped, broken, like a childhood memory rotting from the inside out. The distant sound of Calliope pipes wheezed through the still air, distorted and out of tune. Damon's chest tightened. He turned, stepping cautiously toward the window. Through the grime-streaked glass, he saw her. A little girl in a blue dress, standing motionless between the lifeless carousel horses. Her head was bowed, her shoulders shaking with the weight of her sobs. Damon's breath came slow and shallow. The logbook's warning burned in his mind. Do not help her. But Ivy's small, fragile frame shuddered with every muffled cry, and something inside Damon twisted. What if she really is just a child? His fingers twitched toward the door. Then the crying stopped. A thick silence pressed against the air. Damon's gut clenched as Ivy's head lifted, and that was when he saw it. Her face was wrong. Her skin, too smooth, too pale, stretched too tightly over her skull. Her eyes were nothing but deep, black hollows. And her mouth, Jesus Christ. Her mouth wasn't human. It stretched too wide, splitting the skin from ear to ear. A dark, gaping wound of jagged teeth and black gums. She smiled. And then, she whispered, I never left. Damon stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. Ivy took a step forward, and then another. The horses on the carousel began to shift. Their cracked, peeling eyes turned toward him. The music warped further, slowing to a crawl. Damon's heartbeat thundered. Not real, not real, not real. Ivy took another step. Her mouth kept stretching. Then, the lights in the park flickered, and when they came back on, she was gone. But the music still played. Damon's pulse roared in his ears. The carousel music still whined through the empty park, each warped note scratching at his nerves. The air felt thicker now, like something unseen was pressing down on him. Ivy was gone, but he didn't believe for a second that she had left. Slowly, he backed away, his footsteps crunching against the cold pavement. The security office wasn't far. If he could just... He stopped, his breath hitched. Something wasn't right. Just beyond the carousel, past the rusted game stalls and the abandoned food stands, a door, a single black door, standing alone in the middle of the park. Damon's fingers curled into fists. He scanned the area around it. No walls, no buildings, nothing. Just an old wooden doorframe, standing upright in the open space like it had always been there. But it hadn't. He knew every inch of this park by now. He'd walked these paths again and again. That door wasn't here before. His stomach twisted. He knew what this was. With shaky hands, he yanked out the logbook and flipped through the brittle pages until his eyes locked onto the words he didn't want to see. Rule number 11. If you see a door that wasn't there before, do not open it, no matter what you hear inside. Damon swallowed hard. Then, a sound, knocking, slow, steady, coming from inside the door. His breath turned to ice in his chest. Then came the voice, low, hoarse, like someone who hadn't spoken in a long, long time. Damon? It's me, Marcus Lane. Please help. Damon's skin went cold. Marcus Lane, the last security guard, the man who had written the final pages of the logbook, the one who vanished 30 years ago. The knocking turned urgent. Please, God, you have to open the door. I've been trapped in here for so long. Damon's knees locked. The logbook's warning screamed in his head, do not open it. But what if Marcus was telling the truth? What if he really was trapped? Damon took a half step closer. Then, the door handle turned by itself. A slow, deliberate creak as the old metal twisted against the wood. Something was trying to get out. Damon's hands clenched. The knocking grew violent, shaking the door in its frame. Damon, please! The voice. It was changing, cracking, splitting, becoming something else. Something wrong. The voice doubled. No, tripled. It was still Marcus Lane, but now it was something younger too. A little girl, a familiar sing-song whisper. I never left. Damon's body seized, his throat locked, the door burst open. Damon didn't think, didn't breathe, didn't hesitate. The door had exploded outward, its rotten wood splintering into the night air, and from the darkness within, something moved. A shape. Too many shapes. Fingers that stretched too long. A mouth that smiled too wide. Damon's body finally obeyed. He ran. His boots pounded against the pavement, his breath ragged and sharp as he tore through the empty park. The air around him had changed. The shadows loomed higher. The neon lights flickered, colors bleeding wrongly into the fog. Behind him, laughter. Not from one voice, from many. It echoed from every direction, warping through the night air like the park itself was coming alive. A sound crackled in his ears, his walkie-talkie. Static at first, then a voice, his own voice. Where do you think you're going? Damon clenched his teeth, forcing himself to focus. The logbook. He needed the final rule. He fumbled to yank it from his belt, flipping through the pages with shaking fingers. The words were smudged, written in hurried, desperate strokes. Then he found it. The last emergency rule. If all else fails, reach the main gate before dawn, but do not look behind you. Damon's lungs burned, his legs screamed, but he didn't slow down, didn't turn around. The footsteps behind him grew closer, faster. Something was running with him. No, at him. He could feel it, breathing against the back of his neck. He didn't look. The laughter warped into something else, a chorus of voices overlapping. Damon, let's play. You forgot to say goodnight, Damon. The gate, he saw it. Just ahead, beyond the twisting fog, the park's rusted entrance gates stood open. Freedom. Damon threw himself forward, his legs threatening to buckle as the cold metal loomed closer. A hand grazed his shoulder. Not a hand. Something else. Something with too many fingers. Damon lunged. His body slammed through the gates, the iron bars clanging as he tumbled into the damp grass outside. Then, the air settled. The laughter stopped. Damon gasped for breath, his chest rising and falling in frantic, shuddering bursts. Slowly, he pushed himself up, his muscles trembling. The sun was rising, and the park, The park was just a dead, empty ruin again. No voices, no lights, no figures standing in the distance, just a forgotten skeleton of what it once was. Damon swallowed hard, his pulse hammering in his ears. He made it. He survived. His body ached as he staggered forward, leaving the park behind him, stepping onto the cracked asphalt of the abandoned parking lot. The sun was warm against his skin. Real. Solid. For the first time in hours, he felt like he was awake. He let out a long, unsteady breath, staring down at his own reflection in a puddle of rainwater at his feet. Then, his stomach dropped. The air turned ice cold. Because his reflection did not move, it stood there staring back at him. Then, slowly, it grinned.